In May of 1942, on the scorching plains of the Libyan desert, British Major General Neil Ritchie observed through his binoculars a scene that defied all known military logic. His proud Matilda tanks, considered practically invincible against any German anti-tank weapon, were being systematically destroyed at distances that seemed impossible. The metallic, penetrating sound of projectiles piercing armor echoed across the desert, followed by the roar of explosions and the desperate cries of the crewmen. What Ritchie did not know at that moment was that he was witnessing the birth of a new era in armored warfare, an era where a German 88mm anti-aircraft gun was about to completely revolutionize the Allies' tank combat doctrine. The acrid smell of burnt gunpowder mixed with the metallic odor of melted steel, while black smoke rose in tortuous columns against the implacable blue sky of North Africa. It was impossible for Allied commanders to comprehend how their tanks, which had dominated European battlefields, were being neutralized by a weapon that, theoretically, should have been pointed at the sky. The psychological transformation that would follow would forever change not only armored warfare tactics, but the very perception of what technological superiority meant on the battlefield. To understand the magnitude of the shock Allied commanders experienced, it is essential to grasp the context of supremacy they believed they possessed when they arrived in North Africa. The Matilda II tank, the backbone of British armored forces, was considered a mobile fortress, practically impenetrable. With its 78mm frontal and 70mm side armor, it had withstood all conventional German anti-tank guns in France and in the first desert engagements. British intelligence reports were categorical. No German anti-tank weapon in service could penetrate the Matilda's armor at effective combat distances. This confidence was not unfounded. During Operation Compass, between December 1940 and February 1941, the Matildas had literally devastated Italian forces, advancing through enemy lines as if they were made of paper. General Richard O'Connor had proudly reported that his tanks were practically indestructible against any opposition encountered. The Matilda's armor had withstood direct hits from Italian 47mm anti-tank guns at point-blank range, with projectiles simply ricocheting harmlessly off the British steel. When Erwin Rommel arrived in North Africa in February 1941 with the Afrika Korps, British commanders initially showed no significant concern. After all, the Germans brought the same 37mm PaK-36 and 50mm PaK-38 anti-tank guns that had proven ineffective against British armor. What they did not know was that Rommel had brought something completely different, something that would transform the fundamental nature of desert warfare. The first indication that something was terribly wrong came during the Battle of Halfaya Pass in May 1941. Lieutenant Colonel Walter Bach, commanding a column of Matildas, reported in his diary an experience that defied all his military understanding. "The Germans are hitting us at impossible distances. Our tanks are being perforated like tin cans, but we cannot identify where the shots are coming from. It's as if they are using field artillery against us, but with rifle precision." What Bach was experiencing was the first systematic use of the 88mm Flak 1836-37 cannon in an anti-tank role. Originally designed by Krupp as an anti-aircraft weapon to shoot down Allied bombers at altitudes of up to 26,000 feet, the 80mm possessed characteristics that made it devastatingly effective against ground targets. Its muzzle velocity of 2,690 feet per second, almost double that of conventional anti-tank guns, allowed its 21-pound projectiles to retain enough kinetic energy to penetrate heavy armor at distances of up to 2,000 yards. During that fateful engagement at Halfaya Pass, 15 of Bach's 18 Matildas were destroyed in less than 20 minutes. Survivors described a surreal experience, their invincible tanks being perforated by projectiles that arrived with a distinctive sound, a sharp whistle followed by a devastating metallic impact. Sergeant James Mitchell, one of the few survivors, wrote to his wife, "It was unlike anything we had faced before. It was as if God was shooting lightning bolts at us." Rommel's tactical genius lay not only in recognizing the anti-tank potential of the 82mm, but in developing specific tactics that maximized its advantages. Unlike conventional anti-tank guns, which needed to be positioned in close defensive positions, the 80mm could be positioned on elevated terrain at distances that placed Allied tanks at a severe disadvantage. The North African desert, with its vast flat expanses and exceptional visibility, provided the perfect environment to exploit the weapon's superior range. German tactics quickly evolved into what became known as tank traps. 80mm positions were carefully camouflaged on natural elevations, while German reconnaissance elements lured British tanks into predetermined killing zones. Major Hans von Luck, commanding reconnaissance elements of the 21st Panzer Division, described the tactic. "We lured them like hunters lure deer. They came confident in their superior armor, only to find they had entered a carefully prepared slaughterhouse." The psychological effectiveness of these tactics was as devastating as the physical impact. British tank crews, accustomed to advancing with absolute confidence in their protection, began to develop what military doctors called advance paralysis. Captain David Stirling, of the 7th Royal Tank Regiment, reported that his crews began to hesitate before each advance, knowing they could be destroyed by an invisible enemy at distances that made any retaliation impossible. The numbers that emerged from the first 6 months of combat in North Africa painted an alarming picture for the British High Command. Between March and September 1941, over 260 British tanks were confirmed to have been destroyed, specifically by 80mm cannons, a loss rate that threatened the very viability of armored operations in the theater. Even more disturbing was the fact that for every 80mm destroyed, the Germans were eliminating an average of 8.3 Allied tanks. General Claude Auchinleck, Commander-in-Chief of British forces in the Middle East, sent an urgent report to London in August 1941 that captured the magnitude of the crisis. "We face a weapon that renders our heaviest tanks obsolete at combat distances. The morale of our crews is severely compromised, and our armored employment doctrine requires fundamental revision." The report included devastating technical data. While the 2-pounder gun of British tanks could penetrate 60 millimeters of armor at 500 yards, the German 88mm could penetrate 120 millimeters at 1,500 yards. The initial response from British engineers was to increase the armor of existing tanks, but this only exacerbated the problem. Heavier tanks moved more slowly in the sandy desert terrain, becoming even easier targets for German gunners. The Churchill 7, with 152mm frontal armor, proved particularly vulnerable. Its low maximum speed of 12mm in the desert made it a practically stationary target for 80mm cannons positioned on distant elevations. The deepest transformation, however, occurred in the mindset of Allied commanders. Brigadier Pip Roberts, one of the most experienced British armored commanders, described the psychological shift in his memoirs. "We lost more than tanks. We lost our faith in technological superiority. For the first time since the beginning of the war, we faced a weapon that made us question whether our fundamental approach to armored combat was correct. This crisis of confidence led to a revolution in Allied tactics." The concept of tank charges, massive frontal advances that had characterized British doctrine, was abandoned in favor of more cautious tactics that emphasized reconnaissance, artillery suppression, and coordination with infantry. Major General Brian Horrocks implemented new doctrines that required identification and neutralization of 80mm positions before any significant armored advance. Adaptation was not only tactical, but also technological. The British began to develop tungsten core armor-piercing ammunition, specifically to engage 88mm cannons at greater distances, while simultaneously working on the development of new tank designs that prioritize speed and maneuverability over heavy armor. The concept of the cruiser tanks, how fast and agile, gained new relevance as a direct response to the 80mm threat. The impact of the 80mm extended far beyond material losses, profoundly influencing the evolution of global armored warfare. Detailed reports on the weapon's effectiveness quickly reached the United States, where they directly influenced the development of the M26 Pershing tank and, more significantly, the development program for the future M60 Patton. American engineers, studying combat reports from North Africa, concluded that the era of heavy, slow tanks had definitively ended. The Soviet Union, receiving intelligence through various channels, accelerated the development of its own high-velocity anti-tank guns. The 76mm ZIS-3 cannon, and later the 57mm ZIS-2, were developed specifically as Soviet responses to the German concept of long-range anti-tank artillery. Stalin personally ordered that no German tank must be able to approach our lines without facing the same fate our allies faced in the desert. More profoundly, the 80mm forced a fundamental re-evaluation of the role of artillery on the modern battlefield. The traditional distinction between anti-aircraft and anti-tank artillery began to disappear, leading to the development of dual-purpose weapon systems that would become standard in subsequent decades. The concept of a death zone, areas where tanks simply could not operate due to the density of anti-tank fire, became a central consideration in military planning. The German response to the 88mm success was equally transformative. Recognizing that they had discovered a decisive tactical advantage, the Germans began to produce specialized versions of the weapon specifically for an anti-tank role. The 88mm Pak 43, introduced in 1943, was optimized for ground combat with a lower profile and greater mobility. Simultaneously, the concept was expanded to even larger calibers, leading to the development of the fearsome 128mm Pak 44. The success of the 80mm also directly influenced the development of German tank destroyers. The Nashorn, Jagdpanzer, and eventually the Ferdinand Elefant were all conceived as mobile platforms for high-velocity cannons, capable of engaging Allied tanks at extreme distances. Heinrich Sauerbruch, Krupp's chief engineer, noted in his diaries, "What we discovered in the desert changed our fundamental understanding of anti-tank warfare. It's no longer about stopping tanks, it's about destroying them before they can see us." This philosophy permeated all subsequent German armaments development. The Tiger I's gun, the 88mm KWK-36, was essentially a version of the Flak 36 adapted for tank mounting. The Tiger II took this concept even further, with its 88mm KWK-43 capable of penetrating any Allied armor at distances of up to 2,500 meters. The lesson from North Africa, that range and projectile velocity were more important than raw caliber, became German dogma. For the Allies, the lesson of the 88mm catalyzed a revolution in armored employment doctrine that would extend far beyond World War II. The concept of combined arms, intimate coordination between tanks, infantry, artillery, and air support became not just preferable, but absolutely essential. General Omar Bradley, studying reports from North Africa, implemented doctrines that required systematic suppression of anti-tank positions before any armored advance. The transformation was particularly evident in the development of close air support tactics. The concept of tank busting, air attacks specifically aimed at anti-tank positions, emerged directly from the lessons learned against the 80mm. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt was modified specifically to carry 5-inch rockets optimized to destroy artillery positions, while the British Hawker Typhoon was developed with similar capabilities. More fundamentally, the 88mm forced the Allies to abandon the guaranteed technological superiority mindset that had characterized their initial military planning. Lieutenant General Brian Horrocks, reflecting on the lessons of North Africa, wrote, "We learned that modern warfare is not won by the heaviest weapon or the thickest armor, but by the most effective integration of weapon systems and the fastest adaptation to battlefield realities." The enduring legacy of the German 88mm extends far beyond its immediate tactical effectiveness in North Africa. The weapon fundamentally altered the nature of armored warfare, establishing principles that continue to influence modern military development. The concept that a single, well-positioned weapon can deny large areas of the battlefield to armored forces became a central principle of contemporary military doctrine. Today, when we observe systems like the American Javelin or the Israeli Spike, long-range anti-tank missiles capable of destroying any modern tank at distances of several miles, we see the direct evolution of the principles established by the 88mm in the Libyan desert. The fundamental lesson remains unchanged. On the modern battlefield, range, precision, and projectile velocity often outweigh armor and raw weight. The psychological transformation experienced by Allied commanders in North Africa, the transition from absolute confidence to calculated caution, from assumed superiority to constant adaptation, became the model for how modern military forces approach emerging threats. The German 80mm not only changed the course of the war in the desert, it forever redefined the fundamental nature of armored warfare, establishing that on the modern battlefield, adaptation and tactical innovation are more valuable than any individual technological advantage. As General Heinz Guderian observed in his post-war memoirs, "In the desert, we didn't just discover a new weapon, we discovered a new way of waging war."